I would prefer to write to anything else I can think of.
For Marian Carcache, writing has always been an integral part of life. Carcache is an only child, born, she says, by a twist of fate in New Jersey. But Carcache spent much of her childhood in Jernigan, Alabama, a small town with a population of less than 100. In her early years, she fondly remembers snooping in on her parents' conversations. Conversations, she said, later helped frame characters and plots used in many of her fictional short stories.
A memory that stands out in my mind is from when I was a little girl. My parents never left me with babysitters very often, but occasionally they would. And they'd left me with a babysitter, and we were sitting up late at night waiting for them to come home from a party they'd gone to. And we turned on Columbus television, and the late movie was The Member of the Wedding from Carson McCullers' book. And that was a turning point in my life. I sat there, I couldn't move. I was so enthralled by that movie. So when Mama got home, I told her that I'd seen the most wonderful movie I'd ever seen and told her the name of it. And she said, "Oh, that was written by Carson McCullers. She's from Columbus, Georgia." And I suddenly realized that if somebody from Columbus, where we went to shop and went to the doctor, could write that wonderful book that movie was based on, that I could too. Because up until that point in my life, I thought you had to be from New York or California to do anything.
Carcache's fondness for the South is evident. Her writing is saturated with nostalgia and subtle magic. Today, this college-lit professor says many of our ideas come while grading papers in all-night restaurants.
I would hear lines that another customer would say, or a waitress would mention, and a whole story would come off of it.
Marian spends most of her days teaching, earning a reputation as a hard grader, but brilliant professor. And despite the schedule, she still occasionally finds time to write.
I would rather be a pauper in a cottage writing than a rich girl in a McMansion driving a minivan. Miranda knew she had done it of her own free will. She also knew that a love story was about to take place. Everyone knows the story of Scheherazade saving herself and the other women in the kingdom by telling stories to fascinate and soothe down the king's bruised ego. And then there's the dark Othello, who explained that Desdemona rejected her fairer suitors to love him, not because of spells or potions or chains of magic, but because she fell in love with him while listening to his stories.
Her short stories and articles have been reviewed in several literary journals. The Alabama State Council on the Arts awarded her a fellowship. And Under the Arbor, an opera based off of one of her short stories, earned her a regional Emmy nomination, and viewers in New York.
I tried to write a novel, and I have a novel, but something about it just isn't right yet. I've written it and rewritten it, and there are parts of it that I think are wonderful, but it doesn't all come together yet. So I think the short story is the form that I work best in.
Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, that's the story of a woman named Celeste who grows up in an isolated rural area and goes to college and studies. I think I let Celeste study psychology instead of literature. And while she's out grading papers one night in an all-night restaurant called the Alabama Pancake and Steakhouse, she meets a beautiful evangelist who charms her away from any reason or logic and convinces her to marry him and become an evangelist with him. So she becomes a preacher. I would like to play a female evangelist. That's what I'd like to do. But Celeste actually becomes one, but she can't stay one because it's not her either. And then the trouble starts. The fact that I'm able to play Celeste, that means to me that writers have to get into their characters' minds, that to be a, well, this is going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but to be a good writer, you have to get into the psychology of someone outside yourself. You have to almost split your own ego and be able to get into somebody else's mind or into the mind of someone other than yourself. My funny short stories approach the characters in a different way from the way my serious short stories approach the characters. When I write the serious short stories, it is like I get into the mind of the character. With the funny ones, it's like I'm observing them. It's almost like I'm reporting on characters that I've observed real closely. And that's where the humorous short stories come from. I'll hear a line or I'll see somebody who strikes my fancy, either because they're funny to me or they're ridiculous to me, and I'll create a character around them. And I usually make them sympathetic characters, but they're hilariously funny. But I'm not so much inside their minds as I am observing them.
So, who inspires her?
Well, I did my dissertation on Truman Capote, and I don't think there's ever been a better writer than Truman Capote.
What advice does she have for the writers of tomorrow?
First off, why do you want to write? Do you want to write because you have a story to tell? Or do you want to write because you want to write something you think you can sell? And either way, you probably need to get an editor. What's the truth about the field of writing? The truth about the field of writing right now is that you can hardly get anybody to even look at your work if you aren't already well known. If you go to a small press even's website, most of them have a note at the top of it that say we are not accepting unsolicited manuscripts. So it's a very frustrating field to be in unless you are already, unless you have a gimmick or are already well known, sort of like reality TV. I don't think there's any high that can replace the high of creating something. And I guess people who aren't creative, they find other ways to get that high. You know, they're sports fans, they're people who have a lot of children, and I guess that's them creating some kind of legacy. But I think people who have some kind of talent, and it's almost like you don't necessarily ask for it, it's handed to you. You're just driven to either write or paint or do whatever your talent is.
Can you describe that high?
Well, it's a euphoria of feeling that you've done something that everybody can't do, and you've done it well.